Okay, good evening. Thank you everyone for coming. Of course, tonight's study is in the merit of all the Jewish people, especially in the land of Israel, those who are on the front lines, those that need to be healed, those that need to be rescued. Hashem should protect them and give them everything that they need. If you would like to sponsor a class, sponsorships are available. We appreciate it. It helps us keep these classes going. We decided a few weeks ago we were going to study the Pirkei Avos, Ethics for Our Fathers, as is traditionally studied during the weeks between Pesach and Shavuos and continue through the summer. So we're going to continue that. Chapter 3 starts with the following Mishnah. Akavia ben Mahalalel. He was a contemporary of Hillel the Great, Hillel the Elder. At the end of the Zugos, at the end of the pairs, there was a time in Jewish history in the Second Temple era when the Jewish people no longer had one leader, but it was split into two positions. There was the Nasi, there was the as you call him, the political leader, the head of the academy, and then you had the Av Beis Din, who was the head of the rabbinical court. That's how it was set up. So he was in that era. Okay, so Akav ben Mahalalel says, reflect on these three things, and you will never sin. Number one, know where you come from, where you are going, and before who you are destined to give a judgment before. A judgment and accounting. So he says, where do you come from? You come from nothing. You come from a putrid drop. Where are you going? To a place of earth, rot, and worms. And before, will you give an accounting before God, the Supreme King of Kings? So basically he's saying, if you understand that where you're coming from nothing, and you're going to nothing, and you have to give an accounting to the Supreme King of Kings, then obviously you're going to behave differently. So we'll talk a little bit about Akavia, a fascinating figure. There's not much mentioned about him in the Talmud. He's seldom quoted. But this is important teaching that he says. And so here's the Talmud has a story about Akavia as follows. Akavia ben Mahalalel testified about 4 matters. And essentially he had on these 4 matters, he had a different opinion than the other sages. So at that time, they told him, Akavia, recant your opinion, and we will appoint you the head of the rabbinical court. He replied, I'd rather be known as a fool for the rest of my life than be wicked before God for even a moment, lest people say I recanted for the prestige. So they said to him, if you recant this position, we'll make you the Rosh Av Beis Din, the head of the Av Beis Din, will make you the head of the court. The second position in this Zugos period, where there was 2 Jewish leaders, will make you number 2. You'd be the second greatest Jewish leader and lead the Jewish people together with the Nasi, the president of the academy. So he said, no, I would rather be ridiculed for my whole life than to be known as somebody who was pressured into changing his opinion. And that was the story. He never became the Av Beis Din. He never became the head of the court, and instead he was, like we said, not as well known, but an important lesson in ethics. And we'll have just a quick story and a similar rabbi in the Talmud, and we'll tell a story about. So in Israel, in the current modern land of Israel, the official day of rest is Shabbos, and legally all things have to be closed, including the military. Obviously, except for situations of life and death, which obviously a person could violate the Shabbos. So the military is closed except for strategic things, intelligence and things like that, and operations that needs to be done even on Shabbos. So one time during the Yom Kippur War, there was the chief rabbi of the Israeli military was a rabbi. His name was Rabbi Mordechai Piron, rabbi general. I'm not sure exactly how that works, his title. And he had a great relationship with the heads of the military part of the military, of the security forces, including Moshe Dayan and others. And one day they told him they were going to do something that was going to be a violation of Shabbos. It was not something that was necessary for saving lives, but they wanted to do this thing and violate the Shabbos. And he didn't know what to do. On the one hand, he has a great relationship with these people, and and they're telling him, "Listen, we're just going to do what we want. Don't mix in." On the other hand, this is his principles. So during this time period in 1973, he had an opportunity to be in New York, and he visited the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he had a audience with him, and he brought up this dilemma that he had, and the Rebbe told him, "Do you know the story of Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol?" And of course, he said he did. And the story is in the Talmud, a very famous, important story of Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus, who was one of the greatest sages. Immediately following the destruction of the Second Temple, he was a student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he lived in the city of Yavne, which was spared by the Romans, and the Jewish people flourished. Now, because there was such this great destruction in the Second Temple era, many Jews were murdered, millions of Jews were murdered, definitely hundreds of thousands, depending on the historians. They had a gathering in Yavne where they basically, what was called Nimnu V'Gamru, that they established many laws. It means that they kind of this is the end, they canonized certain laws. So they debated and they deliberated and they said, this is the law. Right? They understood that the Torah learning was going to be decreased in the next generations because of the persecutions. So in Bava Metzia, the Gemara tells us in Tractate Bava Metzia 59b that there was a specific type of oven, if it could become ritually impure or not. Rabbi Eliezer held that it could not become impure, and all the other sages held that it could become impure. So on this day, Rabbi Eliezer was trying to convince the other rabbis that he was correct, and he couldn't convince them. So he said, "I'm going to convince you I'm going to show you, do some miracles, and they'll be convinced by his miracles." So he said, "If the law follows me, this carob tree shall prove it, and let this carob tree pick itself up and move 100 cubits. It's about 150 feet." And that's what happened. This carob tree ripped itself out of the ground, moved 150 feet, and replanted itself into the ground. The sages said, "You can't convince us from a carob tree. That's not how we decide Jewish law, from carob trees." So he tried other miracles. He said, "The walls of the study hall shall prove it," and the walls began to cave in. And they prayed that they should stop caving in, and they actually, for the rest of the existence of that building, the walls were partially caved in. And he did other miracles, and eventually he said, "Even heaven agrees with me." So, and a heavenly voice came out, and he said, "What do you have against Rabbi Eliezer, in whose accordance the law is in every case?" So a godly voice came out, or an angel declared that, the law follows Rabbi Eliezer. And the sages, Rabbi Yeshua and the other sages, said, "The Torah lo b'shamayim hi." The Torah tells us the Torah is not in heaven, right? It was given on Mount Sinai. It doesn't matter if we hear heavenly voices. That's not how Torah law is understood. We have to follow our understanding of the law. We don't understand it like you, and we're the majority. Torah tells us follow the majority. And finally, they followed. They established a law against Rabbi Eliezer, and they ended up banning him from the city of Yavne, or definitely from the. They banished him from the study hall, and he moved to Lod, which is not far away. But he was, for the rest of his life, a very, very tragic story. He never came back into the graces of the sages. And so the Rebbe was telling this Rabbi General Piron, look at Rabbi Eliezer. He stood up for his principles, and he regretted it. He didn't regret it. He paid it. He paid a very heavy price for it. And then he said, what about also? And the Rebbe said, what about the story of Akava ben Mahalalel, who we're talking about tonight? He said, yeah, I know the story as well. But he said, who am I? I'm not Rabbi Akiva. I'm not Rabbi Eliezer. And the Rebbe said, a person has to fight for what is true. what is the truth. And he has to stand before God, and God is the God of truth, which is exactly what Rabbi Akavia, going back to the original saying, this is what Rabbi Akavia Mahalal is really saying, right? He's saying, you're going to have to give an accounting before God. And we see how he applied this in his own life, that he had his convictions, and even though maybe the laws didn't follow him necessarily, whether it's the case of Rabbi Eliezer or the case of Akavia, he said you have to give an accounting before God, and therefore you have to stand up for your principles. And then the Rebbe told him that, by the way, sometimes when you see huge waves coming from the sea, it looks really big. When it gets closer, you realize that they're a lot smaller. And sure enough, when you get back to Israel, they dropped this whole project and ended up being irrelevant. But this is a very important lesson for us, how we have to stand up for our principles, because we have to give an accounting before God. That's the bottom line. Okay. Let's do another Mishnah. Mishnah number 16, as follows. Rabbi Akiva used to say, everything is given as collateral. A net is spread over all the living. The store is open. The storekeeper extends credit. The ledger lies open. The hand, the hand writes, and all who wish to borrow may come and borrow. The debt collectors make their rounds every day and exact payment from man with his knowledge and without his knowledge. Their case is well-founded. The judgment is a judgment of truth, and ultimately all is prepared for the feast. Okay, kind of a strange thing about credit, and what does that have to do with anything? So the commentaries say as follows. Everything that one possesses is given to him as collateral that God can collect from. A net is spread over all the living, and nobody can escape. The entire world is like an open store where one can take what they wish, and the store owner, God, doesn't demand immediate payment, whether reward or consequence. Rather, he gives credit. The ledger lies open, and the hand writes one's actions, and they are not forgotten. So in other words, even though it looks like people are getting away with things, or they're not getting reward for things, the truth is everything is taken into account. All who wish to come may borrow, but everything comes at a cost. And the debt collectors are God's agents. And they make their rounds every day. They exact payment and settle the debt with his knowledge and without his knowledge, whether the person is aware of it or not. Their case is well-founded, and everything is done correctly and legally. Okay, so this is what the meaning of this idea, that a person is collected, that his punishment is decided with or without his knowledge. Okay. Now, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, has an amazing idea about this Mishnah. And he explained that a person who does something, what happens is a person is asked, how should somebody else be treated who did the same thing that you did? And then however you think you should treat somebody else, that is how you will be treated. So in other words, that you are destined to give a judgment and accounting, that we could say that he's first asked to read it inside in the Mishnah. Let's go back a second to read it inside in the Mishnah. Right? It says he is given. I'll read it in the original Hebrew. A person is paid back. He is paid. Payment is taken midaitoi, from his knowledge, meaning we asked his opinion, v'shalai midaitoi, and then we apply it to him, even though he doesn't think that he should be treated the same way somebody else should be treated. That's essentially the idea. And we find this idea as well with King David. King David has a very famous story. We'll get into it a little bit as we see how much time we have. We have a couple minutes, so we won't get into it so much. But the story of David and Bathsheba, King David and Bathsheba. King David had a soldier whose name was Uriah, and the way it worked in those days was that every single soldier would give a divorce to their wife before they would go into battle, except the Kohanim, because a Kohen cannot remarry a divorcee, so they would give a divorce on condition, but every other soldier would give a divorce, and then they would get home, they would remarry. The reason was because they were afraid that if they would fall in battle and their body was not recovered or not recognizable, then their wives would be in a limbo. They wouldn't know if their husband had passed away or not, and therefore they cannot remarry. So in order to avoid this, they would all divorce their wives. So essentially, the long story short, King David sees Bathsheba and he decides to marry her, and he realizes on a spiritual level that she was meant for him. Now, the Talmud tells us that King David did not sin because, of course, Uriah, who was his soldier who was in battle, had given his wife a divorce. So therefore she was not married. And King David marries Bathsheba, and then Uriah eventually is killed in battle, and he continues to live with Bathsheba, and that is the mother, of course, of King Solomon, of Shlomo. And what's really and obviously King David understood that this was not some sort of, illicit love story, but rather it was a story of King David understanding that this was the person who he would have a life with, who would be the mother of his successor. And the problem is that he didn't go about it correctly. He should have, again, if you're judging him on as great as he was, you have to judge him on a very high level. He should have waited until Uriah passed away, and then he should have married Bathsheba. But that's not what happened. He didn't do that. He first married her, and then Uriah died. So what happens? God sends the Navi Nasan, the prophet, to King David, and he tells him a whole story. There were two, and he says as follows: there were two men in one city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing save one little lamb which he had bought and reared. And it grew up together with him and his sons. Of his bread it would eat, from his cup it would drink, and in his bosom it would lie, and it was like him like a daughter. So this poor man had only one sheep, and the rich man had tons of sheep. A wayfarer came to the rich man, and the rich man didn't want to take from his own flock to feed the guests, so he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for his guests. That's the story that he says. He says there's a poor man who has one little sheep, and the rich man comes and takes the poor man's sheep. And King David became very angry, and he said, "As God lives, the man who has done this is liable for death. The lamb he shall repay fourfold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity." And Nasan, the prophet, says, this is exactly what you did. You have many, many wives. You're the king of Israel, and you took this one man's wife. And essentially, he says, the sword shall never depart from your household. You have despised me. You have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. So says God, behold, I will raise up against you evil out of your own house. I will take your wives before your eyes, and I will give them to your friend, and he will lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. So essentially saying to King David that this exact idea that the Baal Shem Tov told us, that we see that King David was given an opportunity to how should such a person be treated, and because he said that this is how this person shall be treated, he shall be put to death, he shall pay it back. And that's exactly what happened to him, that he ended up having a lot of issues with his own family. His own family rose against him, etc., as the prophet says, and eventually came true, all because he essentially judged somebody else. And this teaches us a very important power of how we have to treat others, because sometimes we feel like we essentially, the world, the Baal Shem Tov is teaching us that the world is like a mirror, that the way we treat others, that is how God is going to treat us. And we have to be very careful about how we speak about other people, how we judge other people, and how we treat other people. And that is exactly how God is going to judge us, is based on how the verdict is decided. We essentially decide our own verdict. If we say, wow, such a person who does something so terrible, that's what should happen. That's he's done something terrible. He's sinned. He's right. So that's how God will treat us in turn. So it's very important to always remember these two lessons. We can learn from Akavia to always stick to the truth. We can learn from this story, this Mishnah of Rabbi Akiva, and the story of King David, that we always have to treat others carefully, because that is how, in turn, we will be treated. Thank you, everyone, for joining. If you have any comments, please leave it in the comment section. We love to hear your thoughts, questions, or comments. And God willing, we will see you next week. Have a good Shabbos.